those real fast, thank you. Well, good morning. My name is Nate Schutta. Best way to describe me is architect as a service, and I don't know why my laptop decided not to display that, but there we go. Fun. That looks more like what I wanted to see there. So architect as a service is a good way to describe me. I go places, talk to people mostly about architecture, software, cloud, things of that nature. I will admit the first time someone called me that, I did sound the acronym out in my head and realized it might not have been intended as a compliment, but I'm trying to take it in the most positive vein I can. I've been doing software longer than I care to admit. And for most of that time, I've always thought of software in terms of the technical bits, right? Like what language should we use? You know, what data store makes sense? You know, what new technology do I want to put on my resume? We've all practiced resume-driven design at some point or another. You know, I see that a lot as an architect. Nate, we need to use this on the next project, and I ask why, and they repeat the name to me, and I'm like, okay, cool, you got the name down, that's good, but we need more than that. You know, but I get it, because it's fun, we want to put on a resume, that's not always the best idea. Now, I've had a tendency to fixate on the technology. Right? I think it's what draws a lot of us into this space. It's a lot of fun. It's fun to play. It's a very creative process. I don't think we get enough credit for that, by the way. Coincidentally or not, I've noticed in my experience on both sides of the podium, we have a tendency to ignore the people part of this equation. We forget that software projects involve human beings, and that's not a good thing. I mean, if you're like me, there's a pretty good chance you've skipped a soft skill seminar because I don't want soft skills. I want to focus on hard technical skills. And so we've learned how to navigate these waters largely through trial and error. I mean, I guess if you ask my wife, she'd probably say mostly error on my part, which is fine. This does not come naturally to most of us. I mean, let's be fair. I think some of us got into this space because technology kind of gave us an excuse to not deal so much with the messy human. It's so much easier to deal with like the command line. Although I'll be honest with you, the command line can be inscrutable at some point too. I was working on something last week and the error message I got back was like IP address incorrect or something. I'm like, what are you talking about? I clicked on your link. Like, how could it be incorrect? I saw this t-shirt and I thought, yeah, I can relate to that. You know, that resonates for me. And I saw this on a walk last summer and I thought, again, this seems like a social club I might want to be a part of. But the longer I do this, the more I realize you cannot escape the people. The people comes with the paycheck. There was a very brief period of time in software where a project could actually fit in one human being's brain. We don't live there anymore. And whether we like it or not, software projects are people projects. That means they're full of personalities and emotions and opinions, and while I realize it's so tempting just to focus on the technology, that's not enough for us. You know, especially, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say most of you are interested in raises, promotions, and bonuses. We'd like to continue growing in our career. We can't do that if we solely focus on technology. We have to think beyond that. We have to think about how we influence people. This has come up again and again and again in my career. We also need to think long and hard about how we communicate these technical things to non-technical people. How do we convert these messages so it resonates for them? You know, we talk about technical debt as if our customers are supposed to know what that means. I say spring, and for most of the universe, that means a season, you know, not a Java framework. And yet I have to do this while still, you know, getting code to production reliably and repeatably. I can't ignore that piece either. A lot of this starts with culture. And I know a lot of folks get a little upset with me when I start talking about culture. Like, Nate, what does that have to do with technology? A lot. You ignore the culture of your company at your own peril. Every single organization has a culture. So take a step back and ask yourself, what's your culture like? I've spent a lot of my career in financial services, and so those tend to be very conservative organizations. My previous company, I was talking with my boss one day complaining about something or another, and he just stopped me and he said, Nate, what do you think the color of the walls were when I interviewed here 5 years ago? I said, I have no idea, Jeff, how would I know that? He said, Nate, the exact same color they are today. I said, okay, so it's, you know, office park beige or whatever, that's fine. And I said, I don't understand your point. He said, Nate, if they don't change the paint once in a while just to change the paint, You're at a company that doesn't like change. It's like, we're gonna get to the right answer, just not as quickly as you'd like. Culture is one of those things that forms really early on in a company's existence. I guarantee you've been involved in one side or the other of an interview where you've talked about corporate fit, culture fit. We hire, we attract, we retain based on that. And there's a reason why that comes up. And it informs almost everything we do. Sometimes in big ways, sometimes in small ways. So I worked in an organization for a long time where jeans were not something you were supposed to wear to the office ever. Well, there was one exception. There was like 5 days in the fall as part of a corporate fundraiser. You could wear jeans, but you had to wear a sticker showing that you had donated the proper amount of money to get the right to wear jeans for those 5 days. So imagine my surprise when a couple years after I left, I was back for a friend's retirement party, and I look around the room and half the people are wearing jeans. And so I look at my buddy, I'm like, John, what happened? He said, well, funny you should ask. The day after the head of HR retired, the CEO sent out an email saying, dress for your day, and jeans were now allowed. It turns out the former head of HR did not like jeans. In fact, a friend of mine used to work for him as a manager, and he said in a meeting one day, this guy said to him, I went to college and got an MBA so I'd never have to wear jeans again in my life. And he decided that needed to be enforced upon the rest of us. Culture is where good ideas go to die. And it is super hard to change. Largely because by the time people have risen to a certain level in an organization, they've done that because they've figured out how to work within that culture, how to game that culture. And someone like me comes along and tries to change that, and it's like, whoa, wait a minute. That's a threat to my position. A friend of mine refers to this as the middle management mafia. He was working for a big box electronics retail company as a consultant, and he was doing some really super cool stuff. It was one of those projects where the developers loved it because it was really neat tech, and it was driving a lot of sales, which meant the VP types really loved it. But the middle management folks weren't so sure because this threatened their fiefdoms. They did not like that. Now, one of the best parts about my job is I get a chance to interact with lots and lots of different clients and lots of different industries. And I say there's one phrase I hear over and over and over again, and it is the most dangerous 6 words I hear, which is, that's how we've always done it. That does not mean it is the right way to do it. It does not mean we have to continue to do it that way. It is possible that we did this just on mistake. We just tried it and it worked, or maybe it didn't, but we didn't know how to change it. We just kept doing it. Do we have to keep doing it that way? Maybe, maybe not. You may have heard this quote before: it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. I'm sure you've heard of Machiavelli at some point or another. This is another one of the challenges we face when we try to bring a new idea in. You've got a whole bunch of people who've done really well into the old system, so they are naturally resistant. But the new people are, I don't know if I'm quite on board with this yet because I want to see how this plays out. Ben Thompson wrote this great piece called The Curse of Culture, and he's talking about this at Microsoft. And he's worked at both Microsoft and I think Amazon. He's an analyst these days, actually very entertaining, very good writer, has a pretty good podcast or two out there. And he has this great point about how culture is one of a company's most powerful assets right up until it isn't. I mean, think about Microsoft. For so many years, their culture was Windows, 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 Windows. I'm not so sure Microsoft would be what it is today if they had continued to cling to that. But what did it take for them to break out of that mindset? It was like a completely new management team. I'm fairly confident if Ballmer had stayed there, they would not be what they are now. You have to understand your culture. And then, of course, you have to ask yourself, how do I change it? It's hard, takes a long time. Reminds me of this quote: how did you go bankrupt? 2 ways, gradually, and then suddenly. It's sort of like AI. AI has been one of those things that for seemingly the beginning of artificial intelligence, in 10 years, in 10 years, in 10 years. And now we've got things like ChatGPT. It's like, is that going to replace us? Probably not anytime soon, but maybe eventually, who knows? I assure you can change your culture. It just doesn't happen overnight. And it isn't about buying a tool. I wish it was. I wish it was as simple as just buy this cool piece of technology. Just bring this thing into your organization. It's not how it works. I love this tweet: you're not going to JIRA your way into culture change. Yeah. I wish I'd been smart enough to tweet this before Matt did. Innovation does not mean using a new language, framework, or technology. It's not the same thing, sorry. Now, I've been on this path. Many years ago, a company I was at, we moved towards more agile software development practices away from traditional waterfall. And so one of the first things we try to do is we need some project rooms. So we go to our facilities people and say, hey, we need some project rooms. And they look at us and go, what the heck's a project room? And we described it to them. We said, like a conference room. We put 10, 15 people in there and they do their job. And they're like, whoa, no, you don't understand. We don't do that. We very efficiently put felt line boxes all around the floor. That's what we do. We just kept poking them. But that's not what we want. We want this, we want this. And eventually, I think mostly to shut us up, they relented. And they gave us the literal worst conference room you've ever experienced in your life. It was interior. There were no windows. There was no cell coverage. The only nice thing I can say about that room is if a tornado had hit the building, we would have been just fine. But you know what? It was a start. It gave us an opportunity to show what we were trying to do, build some credibility, show some success, and that served as a model for what we wanted in the next project room. What was so fascinating is once facilities kind of got on board with this, we sort of unleashed their creativity, and they're like, oh my God, we have all sorts of good ideas. We used to just put little boxes, and now you give us this new thing to play with. Like, do you want us to rip down this wall? Do you want us to put glass here? Do you want us to put whiteboard, wallpaper up? We're like, yeah, this is great. This is awesome. By the time I left that organization, they were in the middle of a renovation. Every single IT floor was project rooms, small, medium, large, everything in between. It wasn't even a question anymore. Now, again, I'd like to say you can just walk in, say, I'd like this, and by next week it's done. It took time. It took a lot of persistence, a lot of poking. It's a lot easier if you're the decision maker, by the way. There's this great piece that showed up on the interwebs called the Bezos Mandate. This was written by Yegi. He had worked at Amazon, worked at Google when he wrote this, and just to prove how inscrutable some of these social sites can be, he didn't get his settings right on his Google Plus account, and instead of it being an internal thing, it ended up going external, which was great because we all got a chance to read it. If anybody remembers Google Plus from back in the day. And so he talked about this change that Bezos mandated. It's okay, we're done with this backdoor stuff, so everything is going to be exposed through a public API. That's how teams are going to communicate. We're not going to allow backdoors, we're not going to allow direct reads, none of that stuff. It's all going to have to go through that API. And by the way, every one of these APIs has got to be designed to be public, no exceptions. Now, one of the real cool things about being the founder is you can just say, and if you don't want to do this, that's fine, you're fired. Now, unsurprisingly, developers reacted to that incentive and began to change. There's a pretty good chance none of us has that level of clout. Sorry about that, but it can be done. There's a chance you've seen this quote before. This was with Adrian talking about how, we don't have all your Netflix superstar engineers. And he said, you don't understand. We hired them from you and got out of their way. This tends to be the quote a lot of people quote from this article. But there's another really good line in there, which is this one. You don't add innovation to a culture, you get out of its way. That's what ends up happening in a lot of situations. It's this resistance to change. In my experience, there's an awful lot of folks who would rather fail conventionally than succeed radically. And there just seems to be this idea, as long as we fail the way everyone has failed in the past, it's okay. But if we succeed doing something different, ooh, that'll be weird. And of course, if we fail doing something different, I'll get punished for that. It can be done. There are ways. I will admit, in many cases, the easiest thing to do is just start a whole brand new culture. A lot of organizations will do this. They'll create a lab or a special floor or a different building which doesn't have to follow all the same rules. This actually happened in my previous company. And I think they did this fairly quietly. Started a lab, you had to badge into this one floor, and there was beer in the fridge, and you could wear jeans. But it gives you an opportunity to have a fresh start with like-minded individuals that want to do it this way. And I've seen some companies go so far as to have a completely separate organization, like spin out a new company to do these things. Now, of course, one of the things we have to deal with in this job is the wonderful legacy code or heritage code or hero code, whatever you want to call it. And I admit, when I was taught how to program, I thought everything was greenfield, right? Because everything I did in school were these short little assignments. They might last a couple weeks. It was just me and a text editor, and away we go. And it's so much easier to do that, right? Because I don't have all the shackles of the past. I get to stretch my wings a little bit, do it right. But we don't get a lot of those opportunities, do we? And they almost always go sideways faster than we'd like. So yeah, as part of this, we're going to have to deal with code that needs to change. That comes with the paycheck. None of us gets it right the first time. That's a feature, not a bug. I've always tried as much as possible to leave the code better than when I found it. Practice your inner, scout. But you got to do what's right. If there aren't any tests, you should write some. If a variable doesn't make sense, change the name. There's a chance you've worked with an arsonist firefighter at some point in your career. There's that developer who the management loves because they're willing to run into the burning code base. But the managers also don't realize that that same developer set most of the fires in the first place. And admittedly, I've worked with some people who thrive on this stuff. I actually had somebody come up to me once, and this was a really depressing conversation. He was a young developer, and he said, Nate, I'm trying to do the right thing. I get a defect, I write some tests, I refactor the code, I make it better than it was when I got there, and it takes me a couple days. My last one-on-one, my manager said, why aren't you doing it faster like so-and-so? I give that person a defect, boom, 2 hours later it's fixed. Of course, what the manager wasn't factoring in was that person was making things worse. And in many cases, when he fixed 2 bugs, he made 3 or 4 more. Now, interestingly enough, that developer ended up leaving that organization. He got so frustrated with that. Again, culture kills. So you've got to praise people when they do the right thing. Or as I say to my son more times than I care to admit, take the time it takes so it takes less time. Rushing doesn't work. When you're rushing out of the house, you always forget something. That's happened to me more times than I care to admit. Another way of thinking about this is you do not rise to the level of our expectations. We fall to the level of our training. We all fall back on these tendencies. So we got to think about this in terms of total cost of ownership. It's not just the cost of the code base. Now, certain things stand out. I'm sure you've seen this in your experience. This is a former Supreme Court justice. His name was Potter Stewart. He's infamous for saying, I cannot define it, but I know it when I see it. We have that experience with code, don't we? This code has a smell. Smelly code. I used that phrase at a company I was at for a couple years, and at one point somebody took me aside and said, hey, Nate, you got to stop saying that. I'm like, what do you mean? You can't call the code smelly. Some of the developers are offended by that. Like, well, I didn't say they were smelly. I said the code has a smell. And smells aren't always bad, by the way. It's just something that gets your attention. I look for levels of indent. I was refactoring some code at one point, and I realized that I had to scroll to the right to actually see code. There were so many levels of indent. This was also one of those wonderful code bases where brackets were labeled. That's never a good sign. If you see odd idioms, if you see old idioms, naming things is hard, I'm not going to lie. But when you see really oddly named things, that should get your attention. I was helping my son with something a couple years ago. He built this cool little game in one of his classes, this neat little environment, a lot of drag and drop kind of things, and he made this little ship that you could blow up little asteroids and whatnot. And so something wasn't working, so I was walking through the code with him, and I looked at his code, and I said, so you named your ship Jeff, huh? And he said, yeah. I'm like, why? And he said, I don't know, my ship just sounded like a Jeff. All right, we need to have a discussion about proper naming of variables. Anything in a code base that makes you scratch your head a little bit and go, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, or that's curious, or that makes me upset, that makes me use words I shouldn't use in the office. Too many comments is usually a bad sign, by the way. It usually means I've done something very wrong. If there's parts of the code base you're like, ooh, no, don't mess with that. Like, just leave it alone. Just pour concrete over it. I was in the middle of a code review at one point, and this one part of the code comes up, and this person just stops and looks around and says, no, we don't go there. It's like, oh, well, that's not a good sign. I was in an organization for a long time where we had very low lottery numbers, or bus numbers if you want to be more macabre. And what had happened is a lot of developers had basically dug like foxholes in the code base. And so it's like, haha, can't get rid of me because I'm the only one who knows what goes on past here. And while that might be very reassuring if you're Kathy, here's the problem. First and foremost, eventually a new manager is going to come in and decide, I don't like these single person kind of areas. We're going to get rid of that. And so they get rid of those areas, and they often get rid of that single person that knew that area. The other problem is you can't go on vacation when you're Kathy because you're the only one who knows how this works. So you've got to bring your laptop, and I need to know your phone number and where you're going to be staying and how can I get in touch with you. How about tests? You got tests, right? I hope, I pray. I will admit, you can still fail with lots of code coverage. A friend of mine was brought onto a project to help because they kept having regressions. And so they brought my friend in to help, and he's getting things set up, and one of the first questions he asks is, well, do you have any tests? Oh, yeah, we're very proud of our tests. We've got about 92% code coverage. My friend's like, wow, that's great, and you're still having problems with regressions? Yeah, I know it's weird. That's why we brought you in. So my friend starts digging through the code, and he notices this pattern, but he thinks, oh, this is isolated. He digs a little deeper. That's not so isolated. It's everywhere. And so he goes back to the tech lead, and he says, listen, I couldn't help but notice none of your tests have asserts. And the tech lead said, yes, but we have 92% code coverage. I think I might know what your problem is. Bugs have a tendency to hide where we don't have tests. Now, one of the questions I get a lot is, well, how do I get more code coverage? Display your code coverage stats. Seriously. I joined a project many moons ago where we had like single-digit test coverage when I started. And I know that because I was the first one to run code coverage, and I posted it in the room. And then every time it'd go up, I'd make a new run of it, and I kept praising people for doing good work when they would add more tests. And I'd say, hey, can you talk about how you tested this part of the code base? And by the time I rolled off, we were in the mid-50s, which is not great, but is better than like the 4% when I started. Now, be a little cautious with metrics. You can certainly abuse them. Better to link metrics to goals, and frankly, better to focus on trends. Are we getting better or worse over time? That's the important thing. And I really like short time horizons here. We're better than we were a couple days ago. Let's adjust, let's adapt. Now, there's a lot of great tools out there that can help us with this. Use the one that makes you happy. If you're in the compile language landscape, listen to the compiler. I remember having this debate with somebody about compiled languages versus, dynamic interpreted languages, and he was just adamant that, oh, no, you can't use a language like Ruby or Groovy because, the compiler warns you about so many things and protects you from so many things. And I looked at him, I said, did you realize our build right now is about 600 warnings coming out of the compiler, right? He's like, well, yeah, we've always had those. I'm like, cool. Should we be listening to them? Are they telling us something or not? IDEs are great today. They got awesome tools. Let's use them. Now, I've been in situations where I have to work without a net. I don't have a choice. It's not a lot of fun. Write some tests. Better yet, pair with somebody. Take small steps. It can be as simple as making a variable name better. Do what it takes to establish a little bit of success. So often when we encounter these situations, we just sort of give up because look at how big this mountain is. There's no way I'm going to get to the top. This is terrible. Pay a little bit down every day. I've had this debate with people about tests. They're like, we don't have any tests. There's no point in us writing any tests. I said, what happens if every developer writes one test a day? At the end of the week, every developer's written 5 tests. How many developers do you have? Multiply by 5. Multiply that again by 4 every month. Yeah, you're not going to get there overnight, but you didn't get to where you were overnight either. This is a cultural shift. Again, culture is where good ideas go to die. Best practices are fantastic unless they're ignored. I remember bringing CI into an organization a long time ago, and most of my developers picked up on it pretty quickly, but I had one who was very stubborn, refused to do it, broke the build constantly. I finally got so frustrated with him, he broke the build. I rolled his change back. He sprinted over to my desk, was very mad at me. How dare you? I said, you broke my build again. Stop it. This is where we need to practice influence. And this is hard. You got to get buy-in from your team. This has to be a conversation. There's going to be a discussion. That's perfectly fine. Why are we doing this? Because we want to make the code better. That makes our lives easier. This can be as simple as having a chat over lunch, sharing a video that you saw, talking about what you learned at the conference this week. It's also really important that we be critical of code and not of people. And I know how hard that can be to give someone feedback in a way that they don't take it personally. We tend to get a lot of our self-worth wrapped up in our code. That's hard. I've been working on this little side project, and a couple weeks ago, I shared my code base with a few of my friends to be like, okay, you know this area a lot better than me, so please look at my code and give me constructive ways to do it better. And I was kind of nervous because I did not know this as well as they did, and I knew every one of them was going to find something. But I needed that. I wanted that so that I could learn. Don't be afraid to raise your expectations. You can have this mindset of, we don't ship bad code. I remember pairing with one of my friends, and we were doing something, and she just sort of stopped and said, this isn't good enough for us. We got to rework this. I'm like, all right, great, let's do it. It takes time. All else fails, we should try to write code with the idea that the person maintaining it is a homicidal maniac, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, we want them to be happy, not angry at us for doing something silly. Now, a lot of what this means is we want to avoid complexity as much as humanly possible. Very easy to make something complex. It's much harder to make something complicated simple. Now, of course, our space is full of complexity. Every one of us at some point has run into this. We do this not because they are easy, but because we thought they were going to be easy. Every one of us has had that experience like, oh, this shouldn't take very long. This will only be a couple hours, a day or two, week and a half later, you're tearing your hair out going, what happened? Now, in our space, there's two flavors of complexity. There's the essential complexity of the fact that the domains we work in are challenging. They're hard. I supported financial services for a really long time, and the number of opportunities people describe tranches to me, if I had $1 for every one of those, I wouldn't fly commercial anymore. That just comes with the territory. Nothing you can do about that. But then there's the accidental complexity. It's the things we do that make this harder than it has to be. It's we use an overly complicated tool. We use a noisy technology. We need to minimize that as much as humanly possible. We also need to come to terms with the fact that all code is legacy code at some point. All code lives longer than we expect it to. I guarantee every one of us has something running in production right now that we really wish wasn't. Like, that's still there. I ran into somebody who worked on a project I'd been on. I started the project, I was there for like 5 years, and then I moved on. And I ran into somebody several years later who was on that project, and they said, I think we've gotten rid of about half of your code. I thought, that's it? Like, seriously, I wrote some bad code on that project. Please keep going. We've all had this experience. Oh, sure. We all have good intentions. I know, it's okay. This made me laugh. Old software never dies. You have to kill it. See COBOL. The challenge for us is remembering that our audience is not the compiler or the runtime or the interpreter, it's the human. We need to write code for the other human. This made me laugh. Day 2 on the Python-infested island. I'm going to type help in here. Oh, good, there's a plane. Oh, no, see, you did it wrong. What you really want to do is help this or object help. And it's like, oh, okay, I got the DSL incorrect. So you knew what I meant, but you didn't bother to just do what I asked you to do. This would be like if you went to Starbucks and ordered a large coffee and they refused to give you a coffee because you didn't use the proper DSL. Now, of course, an ounce of prevention goes a long way here. People are going to leave projects. That comes with the territory. One of my students tweeted this out after someone left their project and said, your legacy will live on and get blamed forever. Well played. So do you have an onboarding guide? There's all this one-time setup stuff that you have. I had to reformat this machine back in February, and I've spent most of the last few months remembering all those little things you do once and then forget about. And I was talking to this with a friend of mine, and he showed me the list he has on his phone. Here's all the things I need to install on a new machine. I thought, boy, that's smart. I should do that. Of course, I still haven't done that because that would require a little more effort. But think about how you share knowledge with your teammates, how you share values. That's a hard problem. Most of the teams I've been on have nothing. Or if we have something, it's super out of date. Or it's a really formal system with tickets and admins, and I don't like that stuff. Right? It makes me say words I'm not supposed to use in the office. But more importantly, people just ignore those. Give me low ceremony. Give me a wiki. Give me a website. Give me something that we can modify. Give me the contact information for the team. Give me the on-call rotation, repo, dashboard links, on-call book, FAQ. Do you have a development guide? Do you have coding standards? Where's my pipeline? One of the most important things you can have on a project is a glossary. And I know this is something that we all like to ignore, like, oh, no, everybody knows what these words mean. No, they don't. They really don't. People will fake it until they don't make it in some cases. This might be one of the most important quotes in software. Most of the big problems we have are problems of misconception. We don't have a good idea of what we're doing, and then it's just go, 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 go. I guarantee everyone in this room has been on a project where we've had to start writing code before we even knew what we were doing because, well, the developers are ready. We don't have the requirements yet. Doesn't matter, the developers are ready. My wife's a business analyst. I've heard her utter that phrase more times than I care to admit. But there is all this subtlety. A friend of mine was on a project where the product owner kept talking about clients and customers. And they were using them in ways that seemed like they were interchangeable, and so they were clipping along, and everything was good. And then they got to a point where their PO said, well, that'll work for a client, but not a customer. And everyone went, oh, that's interesting. There is no type system that's going to catch a problem of misconception. There is no test that you can write that's going to catch a problem of misconception. So don't forget about the jargon. Most people won't ask. They'll just pretend. So let's give the team whatever it needs to understand. And let's share that knowledge. I'm a big fan of time capsules, little screencast podcasts that you can do to kind of share this information with people. But take advantage of these touch points with your team. Talk about it. Go get a cup of coffee. Grab lunch, even if it's virtual. Nothing wrong with that. Don't be afraid to share your values. I was in a project room one day where one of my colleagues thought it would be a good idea to trim his fingernails. We all kind of looked at each other, and I said, all right, new rule. No trimming of fingernails in the project room, please. Now, at least it was just his fingernails and not his toenails. That would have been much worse, right? If all else fails, friends, channel the golden rule. There will be a developer that comes after you. That developer may, in fact, be you. Have you ever had that experience where you're looking at some code and you're kind of grumbling to yourself, like, what idiot wrote this? And then it gradually dawns on you that you wrote this, right? Now, I'd love to tell you that it's easy to just get people to do the right thing. It's not. You've got to step out of this technical comfort zone we live in. You have to practice influence. So how do I get somebody to do this? How do I influence other people? Well, this is why we're doing it. Here's the benefits. Let's find some common ground. Now, it's tempting in our space too. Let's fight about it. We have a lot of passionate debates in software, tabs versus spaces. So we need to listen to one another. We need to have a conversation. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard to convince people, really hard. There's two basic approaches, the hammer and the ninja. I'm going to tell you two stories about my family that help illustrate this point. So my son, who is now a teenager, and he's taller than me, which he loves, by the way. When he was a little guy, the daycare center we took him to had a standing rule. Thou shalt wash your hands before being released into general population. Anyone who's ever been around a toddler knows they're not so great with the whole hygiene thing, and they'll stick pretty much anything in their mouth. So that made sense, right? Let's sort of tamp down on, the sharing of diseases. And so we'd get to daycare, be very early in the morning. I would have had no espresso, and I'd look at my young son and say, hey, please go wash your hands. So what would little Everett do at this point? He'd just look at me and say, no. Okay, all right, that's not the reaction I was expecting. And so I would restate my request. I'd say it a little louder in case he couldn't hear me. I'd remind him of our relationship status in case he'd forgotten overnight. I'd say, Everett, I'm your father, go wash your hands. To which he would just cross his little arms and look at me and say, no, never. Now, I'm not sure what to do at this point. My parenting toolkit's pretty shallow. Luckily for me, my wife is way better at this, and so she steps in and says, hey, buddy, I bet I can get my hands washed before you can. She takes one step towards the sink. My kid runs over, starts washing his hands, going, ha-ha, mommy, I'm going to beat you. And she just nods, yes, you are. I'll give you another story. This one's a little more recent, actually. So my son is an avowed meatitarian. All right, he is convinced that vegetables are what food eats. And so my wife, in an effort to try to get him to eat more vegetables, tries to sneak some things in. And so one day she had made vegetarian quesadillas, and I asked her, I said, didn't we just have vegetarian quesadillas? And she just looked at me and said, will you come up with a vegetarian meal then, tough guy? And I said, what do you mean? She said, once a week I make a meal that doesn't have meat in it. My son just looked at me and said, what? Wait, because again, meatitarian. If you would ask my son what vegetable you want, none of them, thank you very much. My wife recognized this. And she realized that by sneaking it in, he wouldn't notice. By using this technique, the ninja, she's actually found things that he eats and now requests, which is stunning to me that she found vegetables that my kid will actually ask for. It's amazing. As much as I wish the hammer worked more often, it doesn't. Your best bet is to convince someone it's their idea. The other part of this is realizing that you may have to work through someone else. You may have to influence the influencers. So many years ago, I was at a company where we had some code quality issues, would be the politest way to put it. And so I was going to try to make my mark by getting test-driven development in there and, bringing in working effective with legacy code, all that kind of stuff. And I got up and I gave this presentation on TDD, and I thought, well, this is something we can all agree on. And the reaction was lukewarm at best. I was disappointed. But one of my friends said, Nate, I'm interested in doing this. Come work with my team. I'm down. And so I worked with him. His part of the code base literally rose up out of the muck. We're sprinting towards a release. Everyone's hair on fire. We're in this meeting talking about all sorts of defects. And he raises his hand and says, I'm bored. My team doesn't have much to work on. And everyone's like, wait, what? How's this possible? We've been writing tests. We're good. That's nuts. He got up and basically just represented the same deck that I'd given a few months earlier. And it was like standing ovation. You're so right. We're doing this. And I'm over there kind of going, well, 3 months ago, you all thought I was an idiot for saying this. And now Jeff gets up here and says the same thing, and Jeff's a genius. What took me a moment to realize is Jeff had tenure. Jeff had been there for like 6 years. Everybody knew Jeff. I was the new guy. What could the new guy possibly know? Sometimes you have to work through other people to get what you want. I had this similar experience not that long ago. We tried to bring GitHub Enterprise into our organization. And so the way we started that was with a gist, because aren't we cute? What, of course, we didn't factor in was that the subversion antibodies would immediately react to us trying to challenge their dynasty. And so we got shot down hard. And so I reached out to someone in the organization that I knew was influential. And I knew he was influential because I asked him one day, what are you doing? He said, I'm flying drones. I'm like, I'm sorry, you're getting paid to fly drones? This is cool. How do I get this gig? And I came to realize he was sort of like the CTO's right hand. When the CTO needed something done, he'd farm it out to this guy. And so I went with him and I said, hey, you like Git? Like, oh yeah, I love it. It's like, we're trying to get GitHub Enterprise in here, and we explained what we did, and he said, oh, okay, no, I see what you did. All right, here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna bring it in, which immediately gives it the sheen of influential person wants it, instead of just rando engineers. But he was also smart enough to say, we're bringing this in to solve our code collaboration problem. Because we didn't have an easy way to share code with one another. And so because he was influential and had a better way of sort of phrasing this thing, he was able to get it started. We had a pilot up and running within a matter of days. It was incredibly popular. We discovered multiple download to Excel kind of things and like, wow, let's start harmonizing this. Very successful. And by the fall, we had several hundred licenses for people to use. So it's a good reminder that sometimes the idea has to come from someone else. You have to use someone else to bounce the ball off the wall. And that always feels kind of weird because you're like, but that was my idea. And smart people understand where it came from. Don't worry too much about that. But never forget that in many cases, a reform often advances most rapidly by indirection. Right? A lot of times when we try to come head on, bad things happen. All right? So when you have an opportunity to do this, approach as an equal, rely on the strength of your reputation. Your reputation speaks for you when you're not in the room, by the way. And if you're not sure what your rep is, you should ask. You may not necessarily like the answer. For a long time, I was known as crazy open source guy, which I didn't think was a bad thing, but some people in the company did. Okay. But you can change it if you know what it is. So look for common ground, quid pro quo. Don't be afraid to be helpful, volunteer. Be respectful. Research your ideas. Use trusted sources. Even if you don't necessarily love it, if you know it resonates in your company, use it. Bring allies to the party. There's nothing wrong with bringing help. The moral of the story is you've got to be a Boy Scout. You've got to be prepared. You got to have a story. The other thing I'll tell you is you have to think about things from your manager's point of view. There might be a reason for the current state. Maybe. Doesn't mean you have to love it. And I'll end with my favorite example of this. I was having this debate with one of my directors about some vendor or another, which I was not a big fan of. He loved them. And I said to him, you don't understand. Their stuff is expensive and it doesn't work very well. And he says, yeah, but Nate, if there's a problem, I snap my fingers and 50 of their engineers show up and they solve the problem. And they're free. I said, dude, you worked on the ELA. You know they're not free. And his response, I could kind of see this thing in his eye, reminded me of that scene from Return of the Jedi where Luke is talking with Obi's Force Ghost, and Luke says, you told me Vader killed my dad, not that Vader is my dad. And I do apologize if that's a spoiler, but come on, statute of limitations. Obi's response is so classic Manager 101, I actually had to look it up to make sure I wasn't misremembering it, and it was this: what I told you was true from a certain point of view. This is absolutely one of those things you're going to run into, my friends. And as much as I'd love to tell you there's a magic wand, there isn't. Overthinking it's going to drive you nuts. So yeah, the technology is easy. It's the culture that's hard. Well, thank you, friends. I appreciate your time and attention. Enjoy your day, and thank you so much. Cheers.